everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Where artists explicitly featured insects or their bodily products, silk, wax, cochineal extract, shellac, and a list of others, in their works to address concepts related to human-caused environmental destruction and biodiversity loss. And I want to stress the biodiversity loss because much attention, of course, is duly paid to global climate change, but far too little attention is paid to biodiversity declines. And those two are intimately linked. But if we don't act in terms of preserving at least a chunk of our diversity now in this unusual human-induced decline of the diversity around us, we'll be in trouble.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Barrett Klein, professor of biology at the University of Wisconsin, La Crosse. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
Your background is in ecology, evolution, behavior, as well as entomology. And I wonder what began your fascination with insects?
Well, we individuals are thrilled by insects. And at the age of 5, I was so compelled aesthetically, behaviorally, by the diversity of insects that surrounded me, living just outside of Detroit, where wildernesses aren't aplenty, that I knew that insects would play a big role in my life. And coming from a family of artists, I really focused on the aesthetics, but the diversity of forms, shapes, colors, behaviors really struck me. And so I began to explore that diversity to look at how insects play roles in community ecology and how substantial they've been evolutionarily and how thrilling the range is in terms of their behaviors, especially social behaviors. So I work on sleep behavior in insects, and I look at honeybees, paper wasps, and some others.
It's fascinating. It really is. And it's interesting how you look at it across history of the planet and how these little creatures that work in swarmology have affected ecology in ways that we can't even begin. And of course, bees, for example, have such a critical role in the agricultural outputs and availability of food for food safety. So it's amazing. You mentioned sleep biology. Tell us a little bit more about sleep biology and specifically some of the areas that you're looking at there.
Sure. So at a young age, I knew I was thrilled by insects, but I'm also compelled by the mysteries associated with sleep and dreaming. So I found that I could combine the two scientifically to better understand what sleep is, how you can describe it or understand it within individual insects or organisms all the way across the animal tree of life to societies. What are the rippling effects of sleep or sleep loss? Say, for example, in a colony of honeybees. So what I do is I look at a suite of sleep signs that have originally been described in vertebrates like us and try to apply those suite of sleep signs to invertebrates. And once you can better understand what constitutes sleep, say in a honeybee or a house centipede or whatever organism you're looking at, maybe you can see or have a better idea of what role sleep plays behaviorally, developmentally, functionally, and evolutionarily. So my lab looks at sleep primarily in arthropods, those jointed, segmented, legged organisms, most of which are insects, with chitinous exoskeletons like an ant. But we also look at bats and other species. And sleep is really remarkable because, well, we still don't have a firm grasp on why we even sleep. There's a mountain of evidence that looks at supporting, say, memory consolidation, learning, maybe consolidation of synaptic growth in our bodies and our brains. But then when you look at animals all the way to, say, jellyfish and hydra, which don't have brains, it makes us rethink what the mechanistic, developmental, functional role of sleep may be. And that's really intriguing to me. So I look at it in terms of, or in the context of societies, what sleep looks like in honeybees. And then when you've got astounding behaviors, like the waggle dance communication behavior of honeybees, where a bee waggles relative to the vertical, and that's just a transposed angle of the angle of, say, food being advertised relative to the sun. And then the duration of that waggle before you turn around and do it again correlates with the distance. So here's a little bee advertising potentially a food site or a home site miles away to fellow bees in a dark cavity of a tree on a vertical wax comb. And while we've parse that apart, we understand how that works by and large, I wanted to see how it may relate to sleep. So I looked at sleep loss and its effects on something as important to a honeybee as it is to humans, communication. And I found that there was a breakdown in communication with some, say, one night of sleep loss.
Again, I can't say how fascinating it is overall. And certainly sleep study has been quite a bit, pretty extensive in humans. And of course, it has a huge impact in terms of our ability to function optimally. And it's not surprising that it has some impact, like the ones you're saying, to some of these bees as well. But it is interesting because you're kind of redefining what sleep is in some of the some of the beings that don't necessarily have brains, for example. But in the case of humans, we use tools like EEG and other means of detecting sleep, for example. And in the case of some of these insects, what are some of the tools that's used to study sleep?
I use a variety of tools, especially imaging techniques that allow me to peer into the lives of bees and other insects. So even in complete darkness, for example, if you have security cameras or thermal cameras, then you can begin to envision what's happening in a bustling colony. And so for me, having security cameras with high definition, high resolution, so that you can peer at individuals and their interactions, that's really helpful. I have a thermal camera, and that looks at emissions of heat from bodies of insects. So again, in complete darkness, it might be, and even in broad daylight, if you sandwich a couple of frames of honeycomb with bees, a whole colony in an observation hive, you can individually paint mark those bees, you can train them to distant sites, and then you can try to gauge or capture the soap opera that's happening among the individuals across the castes within a colony. So if you want to look at something as odd as sleep, you have to look both day and night, and in this case, across the different castes, because bees, as they age, they change tasks. And the tools you can use involve those that examine what sleep is, hoping to define sleep. And that can look at, say, response thresholds being higher to external stimuli. So, for example, if I were to prod you, Scott, and you were fading out into stage 1 or stage 2 sleep, then it might take a greater stimulus for you to respond. So we can look at, say, vibratory stimuli or other things, mechanical devices that prod or disturb for a period to see what consequences there are that we can quantify. But once you establish what sleep is, and I have some gauges, some superficial proxies that correlate really strongly with this increased response threshold, then I can look at behaviors that might be meaningfully affected by sleep or sleep loss. And again, security cameras, thermal cameras, those help, but it all depends on what you want to probe and prod and understand.
So there's a host of questions that I have, but for the time that we have, I am not sure if I can go into that per se, but I want to stay on this narrative of sleep to the extent that this notion of beyond just restfulness, beyond hibernation, to let's something along the lines of, let's say, deep sleep or REM, however it's classified for insects, and how that gets adversely impacted when, let's say, their habitat, for example, is affected because of environmental issues or climate change. Maybe there's flooding or heavy rain or inability for them to actually seek out food, for instance. All these things that have some sort of adverse impact to their ability to sleep and sleep well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit briefly about that.
Oh, sure. So you can think about it under natural conditions or maybe human applied conditions. So if we think about natural conditions, I think you're spot on in exploring all those possibilities of prospective disturbances in environments. And with global climate change and biodiversity loss, we have shifting ranges of organisms that facilitates invasive species disturbing communities. And with that, there are to some extent predictable, but largely unpredictable effects on who the players are expanding and exploding or disappearing from different regions. With that can come disturbances from potential predators, from potential parasites. The loss of habitat can then have effects in terms of what foods you have available. And then simple disturbances from fire, drought, extreme storms can all have effects. And then when we think about applied scenarios, well, I'm working with honeybees, and in Wisconsin, where I live, there are beekeepers that will take thousands of colonies all the way to California in order to pollinate certain crops, like almond crops. Now, imagine the disturbance of a truck rattling you for thousands of miles across the country. Now exacerbate that with pesticides like neonicotinoids, which have known effects on development, on memory, on behavior of different bees. You can only begin to imagine what exacerbating effects human induced changes on the environment may have or even presently having.
So at the beginning, you talked about how your parents were artists. You have the scientific side, but you also have this aesthetic side. And you've recently conducted this survey or research where I believe you surveyed artwork featuring insects by 73 artists. And it was interesting because 47% of the artists addressed habitat destruction or climate change, but some of the other categories were underrepresented. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about just kind of general patterns that you saw with some of this artwork that you surveyed.
Yeah, exactly. So I collaborated with Tierney Brocious, who's a professor at Augustana College, and we're both thrilled with insects, and we also appreciate art. And I've explored the intersection between entomology and art for my whole life. And recently I did a review, a survey review of artists and art that features actual insects and their products. And I continue to explore those topics and being struck, as I hope we all are, about the atrocities related to human-induced environmental distress and destruction. I wanted to pull ideas together in terms of the importance of insects, ecosystem services that they perform, cultural services that they perform, whether we realize it or not, and the world of art and representing insects in art purposefully. And the intentional incorporation of insects thematically, conceptually, physically sometimes in artists' works can have direct meaning and direct impact. So there are a few things that evoke as much emotion, attention, and potentially elicit behaviors as effectively as art, as music, as dance. And so I wanted to survey the world of art as best as I could with Tierney and uncover examples where artists explicitly featured insects or their bodily products, silk, wax, cochineal extract, shellac, and a list of others, in their works to address concepts related to human-caused environmental destruction and biodiversity loss. And I want to stress the biodiversity loss because much attention, of course, is duly paid to global climate change, but far too little attention is paid to biodiversity declines. And those two are intimately linked. But if we don't act in terms of preserving at least a chunk of our diversity now in this unusual human-induced decline of the diversity around us, we'll be in trouble. And so with this survey, I reached out by email and other means of contacting the artists themselves. And of the 73 artists or so, 52 contacted me back and okayed how I was assessing their works. And the others, I took the written explicit forms in addressing their works, either by them directly, the artists, or by art critics or others. And what I found, as you said, was that many of them were really commenting on global climate change, habitat destruction, or both. But of the list of categories, and we adopted 7 categories, 5 of them were adopted pretty famously by E.O. Wilson, and that was HIPPO, his acronym, or an acronym, HIPPO. And that HIPPO stands for habitat destruction, invasive species, human overpopulation, pollution, and overharvesting or overhunting. You can think about overfishing, for example. And we added 2 more insect-specific categories: decline of pollinators and humans' intentional extermination of insects or intentional modification, including genetic modification of insects. And across those categories, 2 were almost non-existent in terms of what we could find in the artistic record. And one is human overpopulation, and the other is invasive species. Invasive species, that was pretty surprising, and some, Isabella Kirkland being one, do feature invasiveness and their destructive effects on human endeavors and natural ecosystems. But overpopulation, I think artists shy away from or don't explicitly share concepts related to overpopulation, probably because it's already intimately associated or linked with every category I mentioned. So it underlies all of them. It exacerbates all of them. And so to talk about it explicitly may be moot or less important. But I would say there's ample opportunity for artists to address these underrepresented categories, because our destruction really starts with how many of us there are and per capita use of resources.
It is interesting that you talk about the fact that there are a couple of areas of human overpopulation and invasive species that are not well represented, but I wonder if that's more of a bias that's arising from the sample size, perhaps maybe, throughout the world, other regions that's not represented by artists. I want to go back to some of the more fundamental aspects, which is that 62% of artists favor the order of the Hymenoptera, which represents the sawflies, wasps, bees, and ants, for example. Why specifically those types of insects when there are so many other thousands of other insects?
That's
and
really
why do they tell a story that cannot be told by maybe some others?
It may not be that they can't tell the story, but because we have such an intimate association with a few players, you could really say a handful of insects that have profoundly impacted us culturally throughout our history, that Hymenoptera, those married winged insects, as you mentioned, the bees, wasps, ants, and yes, sawflies, are one, really speciose, but wait, you could look at the diversity of beetles, and there are over 400,000 described species of beetles. And they're numerous, but you could look at flies and members of other orders of insects. You could look at connectedness. Well, then you could look at parasites like ectoparasites on us, fleas or lice. But really, it comes down to our positive associations with honeybees, as well as a handful of other Hymenoptera. Now, you could talk about a range of reasons that artists adopt insects as their muse. The whole idea of swarming can be frightening or thrilling, inspiring in different ways, and a lot of different Hymenoptera swarm. But if we look at our links with honeybees, we could go back, well, let's see, about 16,000 years ago. The first image, arguably, representing an insect by humans was a cricket inscribed in a bison's bone. And then you could say the next oldest one involves bees. Honey robbing by humans, which is done today in Nepal and other places. And you can see these beautiful paintings, largely in Africa, to some extent in one area of India, and then also in the Iberian Peninsula. And just last year, a gorgeous, detailed cave painting of a honey robbing event was discovered in a cave in Spain. So detailed that we can really reconstruct how these robbers, these hunters, would attain the wax and the honey, as well as the bees from these colonies. So now fast forward several thousand years ago, you have Egyptian artifacts and hieroglyphics that feature honeybees and wasps. And then you've got bees symbolizing monarchies and royalty and working in harmony and industriousness and all these other things, right? So there are a lot of associations and symbols that we've extracted or adopted from not just this order, but a handful of species within this order. And because of our reliance on honey as our first primary sweetener and on wax as an adhesive in all manner of uses, and propolis, we think about bees in a very positive light. And couple that with a relatively recent concern for bees and bee diversity. I mean, there are 20,000 plus described species of bees on the planet, and yet we focus on Apis mellifera, Western honeybees, and a handful of others. So the importance is actually underrepresented, and the importance of one species tends to be the focus that drives this bias that I found in the survey.
I want to ask a question, which is, there's an assertion that you're making, which is that, again, thank you for explaining the positive association that we have with bees based on human history, and really a food source and a symbolism of industrialness that I mentioned before. But you assert that policymakers, scientists, and the media maybe they're trying to do a good job persuading us to take drastic change when it comes to stop global warming, but it's not necessarily working well, and it's missing a piece of that strategy. And one of the strategy that you talk about, again, you've been kind of alluding it throughout your narrative, is this notion of artwork, and how art, specifically in this case, featuring insects, can evoke very powerful emotions. And can those emotions be powerful enough for us to change mindsets, change our hearts, and change behavior towards improving our environment and our planet?
Well, if we think about the relevance of art, there's some recent newsworthy items, like people gluing themselves or otherwise desecrating famous works of art in museums around the world in order to draw more attention to our our causal agents, us as causal agents for global climate change, that really tells me that art is relevant, that people pay attention to art. And if the destruction of a piece of art, and it's actually not an irreversible destruction, it's just a superficial, momentary desecration of the art, is enough to rile emotions, that should tell us a lot about what museums, what artists, what art does for cultures, why it plays such a profound role in shaping our cultures, shaping our mindsets. And yes, I think art is a powerful means of influencing our behaviors, potentially eliciting activism, as well as being an object of activism. And when I think as a scientist, I'd like to think that my work can reach some people and influence some people's thinking, maybe inspire them to explore and even celebrate insect diversity or the peculiarities of sleep, the profound nature of sleep, and other aspects that I happen to study. But while science is necessary, science in and of itself is insufficient to move the minds and hearts of the masses. And we really rely on independent sources, independent disciplines, independent means of influencing change. And art is part of the picture, maybe a large part of the picture in influencing our behaviors.
I'm currently on your website, occupating.org, and looking at some of the art pieces here. And I wonder if you could, again, for the audience, I can't see at this moment, but if you could just highlight maybe one or two and how those pieces are actually communicating some of the things that you're researching.
Sure. So when I do science, I think and I behave with aesthetics in mind. And when I work on art, I think about scientific concepts. So there's a gray area and a strong bridge between the two. So as I create artwork, I think about really the glory of insects and the roles they play in our lives. So recently I've been working on collaborating with insects, working with my honeybee colonies. I might include a recycled bicycle helmet and see how they build off of that, and then wear that piece and even sculpt off of it using beeswax. I'll also build materials made of other insect products like silk and shellac and bald-faced hornet nest paper and things like that. But better yet, I think I should highlight other artists' works that are relevant to the survey that we conducted. For example, Cornelia Hesse-Honegger, one of my heroes, she's an artist. She started as a scientific illustrator in Zurich, Switzerland, and she really became an environmental activist, a collaborative scientist. And if you look at her works, she'll highlight, say, in the proximity of nuclear power plants, insects, primarily hemipterans, true bugs, that become bilaterally symmetrical, mutants. And she claims because of the radiation from these, even the cleanest nuclear power plants. So pollution is a big red flag that's inspired artists to produce works. Another artist would be Erica Harsh, who flew over the North Pole and was struck by the fragmentation of the ice and produced a work that I featured in the survey called Melt. Another would be Catherine Chalmers. And I just in last month was on a panel actually with Oliver Millman, the author of The Insect Crisis, to talk about her work and how it relates to insects and even insect declines. So a number of artists, including my own mother, has contributed works related to invasive species across the board. And, I mentioned that some of these categories that we chose to highlight to feature in the survey are less represented and their biases toward others. And one that's really less represented, I think, isn't in our mindsets often enough, is overharvesting, overfishing, overhunting of organisms. We only had one example of that in all of the art.
One of the areas that it doesn't really require a lot of persuading is the fact that, again, going back to agriculture and food safety, bees play such a critical role. And the fact that not only pesticide, but these invasive species is really having an impact in terms of our agricultural output. And throughout the world, because of La Nina, flooding, heavy rains, or in some cases the opposite, droughts,
Right.
lack of rain. Food safety has become a huge issue. And then you also mentioned biodiversity. Aren't those compelling enough in terms of not only impact for insects, but also humans as well?
Well, let's think about a couple of examples that are really relevant to what you're saying. We could talk about pesticides and how we really don't need them by and large. And if we reduce those, biodiversity will increase. We could talk about the monocultures in the form of agriculture, in the form of our lawns. We could think about cows and their relatives taking up roughly 25% of the land mass of the United States, close to that of the world. So how are we investing our resources? One approach is not just to reduce pesticides and to think about how we're treating our own yards, but what we eat, how we eat, largely influences global climate change and biodiversity declines. So if you choose, for example, to be a vegetarian or a vegan, if you think about simple rules in ecology and energy loss from lower trophic levels going up, it's far more efficient to go to that base, that fundamental, that foundation, the lowest trophic level of plants, right? And so we can, if we're careful about it and responsible, then we can change our diets, even moderately, in that direction. Now, we haven't mentioned entomophagy, the eating of insects, and that's played a huge role in human history and human culture. Some suggest that it's even shaped our brains and allowed us to play the dominant role we have today, that extra nutrition that we garnered from insect sustenance early in our history. But today, there are entrepreneurs and there are UN movements and documents that are reshaping how we think about food security and sustainability, because instead of, say, focusing on a really wasteful cow and pig and chicken, what takes up less space, what produces less waste, and what per pound produces more nutritive matter and protein? Well, insects. And everything ultimately depends largely on insects.
Well, this is a fascinating conversation, really is. And I think there's many different ways that we could go with this conversation. And I do actually want to welcome you back to another session, maybe in a few months, because I think we're just kind of scratching the surface.
I'd love that.
But again, I think this notion of, I guess I want to question you in the sense of our work is a powerful medium, but do you have any evidence that artwork that focuses on insects is really changing the hearts and minds of people?
I wouldn't say specifically of insects. Those data need to be collected, but there have been exhibits and a couple of studies that have looked at art as it relates to global climate change affecting people's mindsets. And I've just begun to scratch the surface. And as you said, there are biases in our study on it that we hope to avoid in terms of reaching out to underrepresented communities with languages I don't speak, for example, around the world that may be less represented or not represented on the internet, to unveil art that features insects or insect products designed, say as muses, designed to elicit behaviors, to shift our mindsets, to change our approaches to how we live our lives for the better.
So with that, I have been joined by Dr. Barrett Klein, a professor of biology at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.